heard the story, you save the best for last, but at the Abbeville Institute, we always start with the best and then save the last for last. For generations of Americans raised on the pomp and pageantry of American patriotism, it remains difficult for us to realize that Americans have not always loved their flags. Today, every state capitol, every post office, every school building, even every automobile dealership proudly displays large flags and banners, and the larger the better. We celebrate Flag Day, Veterans Day, Memorial Day, and more recently, and perhaps somewhat disturbingly, I've noticed people are beginning to celebrate British Remembrance Day throughout the year. In all of these events, we are surrounded by flags and by reflections upon those ideas those flags are meant to represent. But Americans did not always surround themselves with ideas and symbols, whether that be in the form of flags or even our founding documents. Now, it comes as a surprise, perhaps, to learn that Americans did not consistently use a national flag for almost 2 generations after the War for Independence. Like the process in which we nearly forgot the Declaration of Independence for those 2 generations, the first official generations of Americans did not need symbols to remember why they fought or what kind of country they sought to maintain. They did not need symbols, nor the Declaration of Independence to remind them of those things. It was not until the War of 1812 when a new generation came of age with no memory of the late war that Americans started considering flags, songs, and poetry as national symbols. Although they had already built large government buildings that hearkened back to ancient Rome or ancient Greece, as if to show Americans that their self-government rested in something noble and ancient, things that might endure as part of a larger civilization, they had not really addressed the issue of flags. But following the War of 1812, Americans continued to look for things that were distinctly American. Hence the massive national flag that flew over Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor and inspired Frank Key to write his poem, The Star-Spangled Banner, which did not officially become a national anthem until many generations later and was added to a British drinking song for the tune. As the country grew in both population and territory in the antebellum period, new states entered the Union, but few, if any, of these states came together around symbols. No flags of Tennessee volunteers who fought to secure Spanish West Florida were needed to make that part of the country into the new states of Mississippi and Alabama. The fleur-de-lis may have existed in French Louisiana, but it was not needed to make the people there see themselves as a distinct group deserving their own self-government and statehood. Texans did not need a flag to consider themselves the Lone Star Republic, but it sure helped a little bit. Indeed, few states added to the Union prior to 1860 came waving their own flags, their own state birds, their own state songs, or as may even be the trend today, an official state breakfast. They did not need any of these things to be states. Likewise, when southern states commenced seceding in 1860 and 61, few, if any, with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, had anything like a state flag. One of those exceptions, of course, was South Carolina, which possessed flags that had been left over from the days of the War of Independence, like the palmetto tree and things along those lines. But again, most of them had no flag at all. Mississippi led the way when it seceded in 1861 in creating its first state flag, which focused on the symbol of a magnolia tree, and other states who were seceding followed suit. Now, most of us in this room are familiar with the origins of the existing Confederate battle flags and the transition from the stars and bars to the stainless banner onto the battle flag that we know today, which might possibly have just been a naval flag. And we're also familiar with how these flags changed over the course of the war, from the stainless banner and to something that was more recognizable on the battlefield. And I don't believe there's any need to go over that history here, but one salient point should be made, and that is nearly all Southern states lost their state flags and their Confederate flags at the forefront of Reconstruction. They all lost them. They do not have state flags during Reconstruction. When Reconstruction governments repealed Confederate state laws, they intentionally repealed all legislation which created Confederate symbols like state flags. So there are no Confederate battle flags in state flags because there are no state flags. They are unofficial if they exist at all. This continued to be the case throughout the 1870s and 1880s. Battle flags captured by Union soldiers remained safely in Northern hands, and the Confederate flag largely disappeared from the South and other places in the United States during that period of time. It is by and large not something that is visualized by Southerners in the middle to the end of the 19th century. Now, the importance of this absence rests in the fact that the Redeemer and Bourbon governments that came to power in the 1870s and 1880s, as well as those clandestine militia groups like the Ku Klux Klan or the Red Shirts in South Carolina, rarely used Confederate symbols during their efforts to either force out African American from positions of power or to remove carpetbaggers from their state governments. The Confederate flag, in other words, was not a driving force of hate and subjugation during this most brutal period of our country's past. In fact, very few symbols are actually present during this period of time. Perhaps the only exception to that, again, would be South Carolina, with the Red Shirts that were led by Wade Hampton. And we've already heard some explanation of why that occurred. But things began to change by the end of the 19th century. Much like the younger generation of Americans around the War of 1812, who looked for new symbols of their cultural character and government, Southerners at the end of the 19th century proudly embraced symbols to represent both their fight to protect their interests and freedoms, but also symbols to represent their commitment to national unity. And what they used most often was the Confederate battle flag. Confederate veterans, anxious to relive their heroic deeds, Southern parents, hoping to instill manliness in their sons, intellectuals, hoping to understand their cultural circumstances, and Southern politicians, generally looking for votes, joined together to celebrate Southern distinctiveness as well as the kind of cultural loyalty that those things represented. And above all else, they joined together to celebrate the importance of physically fighting to protect what matters most. Historians love to condemn the lost cause mentality of these Southerners, who in the minds of today's progressive intellectuals only came together to subjugate Southern blacks. No doubt African Americans in the South did suffer at the hands of progressive Southerners who implemented segregation and voting restrictions, even though that for the most part these were largely urban phenomena. But what is missing in the depictions that the left makes of us today are the cultural results for Southerners as a whole at the turn of the 20th century. Whether white or black, French Louisiana, or in this case, Cherokee Indians, the efforts of Confederate veterans inspired Southerners to love their Southernness, while also inspiring them to fight for liberty. Not coincidentally, in the South, Confederate symbols quickly did for Southerners what the American flag and its symbols had done for New Englanders and Midwesterners. Parades, flag waving, patriotic symbols, and a flourishing of Southern music and literature swept through the region and reflected long-standing Southern traditions that fostered a love for land and its people. In other words, as the South finally recovered from the war and the problems of Reconstruction, that's when the Confederate flag became seen in more widespread ways. There was nothing inherently dangerous about this, nor was there anything connected here about hate. Indeed, progressives in that day, like progressives in our day, well understood the importance of letting people enjoy their own peculiarities as long as it did not interfere with a larger progressive plan. Civil War reunions, especially the 50th anniversary of the war, proved critical to the new kind of country that American progressives scurried about creating. It was a country where all Americans could agree to a singular national narrative through which we historically moved from subsistence and slavery to greater forms of liberty. Few things captured this better than the election of Woodrow Wilson to the office of presidency. Now, Wilson was kind of a pseudo-Southerner, but he was a bona fide progressive. And for Wilson to be elected was a symbol for many progressives of what they could achieve. After all, Wilson was the quintessential progressive, a new American, if not in many ways a new Lincoln. Culturally, these efforts coalesced in what remains not only one of the first motion pictures, but also one of the most widely viewed films of all time, Birth of a Nation. For those unfamiliar with this film, it is a story of division and reunion just as much as it is a story about the Ku Klux Klan. Now, in some ways, critics are finally beginning to pick up on this. In many ways, Birth of a Nation was also about the Spanish-American Wars. You see here in this image, this fellow does not look like Jeb Stuart. He looks like Teddy Roosevelt on San Juan Hill. That was intentional, it was purpose. Nonetheless, in this film, the good guys are Confederates and Klansmen, but also in this film, the good guys are Northerners, Union veterans, and above all, Abraham Lincoln, who, according to the film, had he lived, would have brought the country back together again without much fuss. And my point here is that with Birth of a Nation, just as we see with Confederate veteran reunions and Northern and Confederate reunions, we have a larger progressive vision. It was Lincoln's America that survived the war, not Jefferson's America. And I won't go into detail about this point except to send you over to the Abbeville Institute website where you can learn all you care about Lincoln's America. There's plenty of great resources there. But I will say this, in short, Lincoln's America, as created by progressive intellectuals in the late 19th century and early 20th century, needed the Confederate battle flag. Indeed, one could argue that the Confederate flag entered Southern and American consciousness most fully at the turn of the 20th century, and as a symbol not of regionalism, but as a symbol of national unity. It was in part a progressive banner and a tool of progressives to promote their political agenda at the national level. If progressives could unite the United States after a civil war, imagine what progressives could do for the future of the country in the 20th century. And the Confederate battle flag was there all the way. Progressives could unite the country, but make no mistake, at one level, the Confederate flag was a progressive symbol. It was a symbol of Lincoln's America. And it should come, as an aside here, it should come as no surprise to us that as Lincoln's America crumbles in the 20th century, so too does dedication to the Confederate flag. And this is something I'll pick up on throughout the remainder of this presentation. But not all Southerners thought in such crazy progressive terms. Many still thought, as were the generations after the War of Independence, that human beings needed inspiration in order to remain free. Unlike progressives, many Southerners insisted that it was not enough to instill or indoctrinate people with the right ideas, or in the New England parlance, ideas. People needed to be inspired to defend something tangible, to defend something they encountered and lived with on a daily basis. In other words, habits of daily life mattered more than holding the right ideas and doctrines. School children might recite the Pledge of Allegiance, but it was more important that they travel down Jefferson Davis Highway or Lee Highway, or attended schools named after Confederate heroes and generals, or otherwise encounter Southern heroes and their efforts during the war on a regular basis, every morning and every evening. From the 19-teens through the 1930s, Southern townspeople went about naming everything they could find after Civil War symbols. They also built monuments, paid for from the pennies and the dollars, more pennies than dollars, collected from countless simple and plain folk who cared little about scientific racism, white supremacy, or any crusade for hate. They were common people who believed their world now needed the ghosts of Confederates to help them protect it. The result was a society thoroughly immersed in Confederate imagery. It was not created by an effort to subjugate blacks, though perhaps that may have been on the mind of one person or two people somewhere in the South. But these images were created to engage Southerners with the demands of living as a free people. Sometimes you will have to fight to keep your liberty. Sometimes you will be required to fight wars to defend those things that matter most to you. And while we may distrust this militaristic side of Confederate symbols, we still need to remember two important things. First of all, the Confederates fought a war. That's why they were Confederates. They did not we don't remember them because they were plowing fields. We remember them because of their service on the battlefield. It's also important to understand that these were people fighting to defend their homes, their families, and their daily habits. And what would you rather have? People defending things they find at home, or would you rather have people fighting around the world to defend their allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands? Would you want something concrete or something abstract? And so by the 1920s, Confederate symbols firmly became a part not only of the South's culture, but by that period of time had become firmly a part of the popular culture of the United States, of all Americans around the country who encountered these things on a somewhat daily basis. And this is particularly true in the realm of entertainment. Now, I will be the first to admit, Northerners did not name streets after Stonewall Jackson. I don't know, maybe there's a street named after Jackson. But I'll assure you that in the drive-ins and the cinemas that were located on Ulysses Grant Highway, there were films that depicted Southerners and Confederate symbols in a very positive light. In some sense, these early films depicted the South as either a people victimized by fanatical politicians, as with So Red the Rose, or they depicted Southerners and the Confederates as symbols of manliness and heroism, as in The Prisoner of Shark Island. Now, yes, there were some contrary symbols. Southerners were not always depicted so well. After all, who could resist Betty Davis as Jezebel? But by and large, in the 1920s and 30s, Southerners were still treated as good people with whom Northerners could work, even work together to capture bandits, as we might have seen in Roy Rogers' The Arizona Kid. This is one of the first visual images I remember as a child, was on Sunday morning watching Roy Rogers' TV shows, and the Arizona Kid was always one of my favorite. Now, I cannot proceed without mentioning Gone with the Wind, which definitely inspired Southerners to love their culture and their Confederate heritage. No doubt it inspired a resurgence of Confederate balls, stamped positive depictions of the South among young Southerners' minds, as seen even today in the continued role of Confederate heritage among college sororities and fraternities, which I understand in the state of Georgia it's now illegal to dress in an antebellum gown on college campuses. Is that the case? Is that? Okay. Okay. Good. But it certainly, Gone with the Wind also inspired and instilled within the minds of other Americans a simple message about the nobility of the Southern people. Confederate symbols and its flag and its people enjoyed a period of innocence from the 1920s into the 1930s, even all the way into the early 1950s. Now, the left today would argue this innocence hid a deep and abiding sin of persecution, of hatred, brutality toward Southern blacks. But Confederate symbols did not inspire such treatment any more than guns inspire people to murder. And I think it should be noted that from Randolph Scott's Bell Star to Bing Crosby's Ditsy, and we tried to find clips from this, but I was unable to do so. I had no idea that Bing Crosby starred in a movie about the origin of Ditsy. That Confederate symbols continued to enjoy a positive treatment in American popular culture throughout the middle part of the 20th century. Now, few things represented this treatment better than Walt Disney's Song of the South, one of the most charming depictions of Southern life brought to film. Now, true, we must admit that leftists who hate the film are probably right, that its depiction of plantation life bore little resemblance to reality. But what is important, I believe, is that Song of the South captured something that was memorable. It captured the importance of love, of friendship, of humor, and above all, one of the great themes of this program, the show, was the need for forgiveness when living in a fallen world. Now, I will soon, in a moment, argue that what the new left really hates most about progressive Confederate symbols, yes, they were progressive Confederate symbols, is this sense of forgiveness. A sense of forgiveness that was thought essential by early progressives to form a country like the United States and for that country to continue to exist. I think it's kind of obvious to all of us that forgiveness is a virtue conspicuously absent from all modern-day progressives. They want those they oppose to beg for forgiveness, but they never exercise it toward others. But before addressing that issue, I want to turn our attention to the way Confederate symbols were treated at the middle of the 20th century. And there were three ways it was used, and I want to take each of these three ways separately. The first dealt with the American military presence overseas, as Americans fought 2 world wars and a series of smaller wars related to the Cold War and then eventually the War on Terror. The second way in which Confederate symbols were used involves jilted progressives and the New Left transforming their Confederate flag into a symbol of hate and ignorance. And a third use simply extended the Confederate flag really as a symbol of national unity and entertainment. I'm going to look at each of these 3 for a moment. The use of Confederate symbols by Southerners to inspire the need to fight for freedom paid off. Street names, stories of Confederate heroism, indeed the entire corpus of the lost cause infused Southern people of all races and all ages with a kind of spiritedness needed for the United States to enter the world stage. This Tulsa and Atlanta brochure from 1918 and 1919, I think, ably depicts this side of the story. Here we see 2 soldiers shaking hands, one American from World War I and the other, surely you recognize the other, Robert E. Lee. It is critical, I believe, that everyone understand the importance that the lost cause played in American military action during the 20th century. And this is a subject that has been completely overlooked by American historians and other scholars. It inspired young Southerners to enlist, to fight, and to endure the long, hard road of war, from the trenches of World War I to the islands of the Pacific in World War II, through the hardships of Korea and into Vietnam. The rebel yell was a fearful battle cry heard in all of those places. It sparked fear in the spines of Japanese and German soldiers, while simultaneously warming the hearts of Americans and its allies. It should be noted that when Winston Churchill visited the United States after World War II, he insisted on meeting with Douglas Southall Friedman, who was the great biographer of Robert E. Lee and Lee's generals. Churchill understood the source of America's fighting tenacity, and he wanted to meet the man who had helped instill that among so many of them. So as we see, whether it be on Okinawa in World War II, or even in much of the popular culture and films around World War II in the 1940s, many Southern, Confederate, and even the flag itself, values and symbols were repeatedly used. Errol Flynn played a Southerner in Rocky Mountain. Here we have a Southerner. You can't really make it out there very well, but he has a Confederate flag with him, a very small one here in Korea. Here's Arleigh Burke, USS Picking, with a coffee mug with a Confederate flag on it. Here's another example of the Confederate flag being used in Korea. Several other films, Drums in the Deep South. Even Ronald Reagan enjoyed playing in movies depicting Confederate heroism. And these were people that even Shirley Temple could love, right? And one of my favorites, Run of the Arrow. And if you can't make this out, it reads, the strange saga of the Johnny Reb who turned Sioux to wage a one-man war against the Yankees. The point here, ladies and gentlemen, is that throughout the middle of the 20th century, even here in Berlin in 1958, Confederate symbols became increasingly associated with military valor. In movies, Confederates were held up as model soldiers, as I said, that even Shirley Temple could love. Now, while it is most definitely too much for us to argue that the ghost of Stonewall Jackson somehow helped liberate Jews from concentration camps, it should be indisputable and repeated over and over and over again that without Confederate symbols, the capacity of Americans to fight world wars would have seriously been lacking. As William Faulkner reminded us in The Unvanquished, there was a time when every Southern boy one day asked himself, what would have happened on that July day in 1863 if we had just taken that hill? Those boys grew up, and they took those hills on the Pacific Islands of World War II, where they found their answers. Now, progressives began to change their mind in the 1940s. After years of cozy relations with Southern politicians, the New Deal coalition began to break down on the eve of World War II. Progressives soon realized that Southern conservatives would no longer toe the line. Hoping to break their resilience by pushing for greater civil rights for Southern black voters, the progressive testing of the waters in Southern politics backfired. The Dixiecrat movement brought to the forefront a new generation that the left now paints as rabidly racist. And, admittedly, some of them probably were. But most of the people in this movement were fearful of increasing federal power in the central government and broadly hopeful that national regulation of the economy could be reversed. In the minds of progressives, however, the Confederate flag quickly came to be associated with their opposition, and what is opposed to them must be stamped out. They came to suspect that a new South, a wealthy South, one that was fully recovered from wars, could not be counted on to support a national progressive agenda. The South now stood in the way. So by the 1960s, progressives intentionally turned the Confederate flag into a symbol of hate, at least in their own minds, not in the hearts and minds of Southerners, black or white, or even in the minds of most Americans. Northern politicians, in fact, still paid lip service to Confederate symbolism during the 1960s and even during the peak of the Civil Rights Movement. John Kennedy, the quintessential progressive Yankee, understood that fighting the Cold War demanded some positive deference to Confederate symbols. Neither he nor any major American politician at the time attacked those symbols, even during the peak periods of unrest of the 1960s. There is a key reason for this, and that is Southerners did not use the Confederate flag very widely during their resistance to the Civil Rights Movement. It was there, and it was a part of it. And there are examples of where the Confederate flag was elevated to positions of importance out of opposition to civil rights legislation. But there were very few, if any, people wearing Confederate flag T-shirts or Confederate flag hats. Instead, they most likely and more often used the American flag in these efforts. Nor did Southerners who opposed civil rights legislation hearken back to the Civil War. Strom Thurmond, Carter Glass, James Eastland, John Stennis, none of these men appealed to the Confederacy or even the Civil War in any of their major speeches against civil rights legislation. They used terms like states' rights and things along those lines, but they did not directly appeal to the war or Confederate heritage. Now, there is perhaps one notable exception to this, and that is the gubernatorial policies and presidential campaign of George Wallace, governor of Alabama. Wallace was very intentional in using Confederate symbolism And while not exclusively the backbone of his campaign, he did try and equate Confederate symbols with segregation. And in the minds of young members of the New Left who witnessed this, they came to believe that the Confederate flag represented the worst aspects of conservative America. And I think it could easily be argued that Southerners probably did not do enough to protect their now reclaimed Confederate symbols. Now that progressives were abandoning it, they took the opportunity to make it completely their own. And they probably could have done a lot more. These were at the margins. And it should be remembered that Southerners, by and large, voted for Richard Nixon, not George Wallace. Now, I don't know which would have been better or worse, voting for Nixon or Wallace. But anyway. Not coincidentally, in the 1960s, there was a marked change in popular culture in the way in which Southerners and Confederate symbols were treated. A case in point was 2000 Maniacs, a classic zombie movie that depicted Southerners as backward, ignorant, and violent people. They were hungry for the blood of peaceful Northerners. New left progressives knew who the real enemy was, and thus commenced a concerted, slow, but uninterrupted effort to demonize the South and anything that was associated with it. Well, what better place to start than the Confederate flag? But even as progressives commenced their campaign in the 1960s, Southerners in the world still accepted the Confederate battle flag as the centuries' greatest symbol of military valor, honor, and dedication to cultural liberty. For the modern liberals, the New Left, these values of valor and honor and tradition, those things just seemed kind of weird. But Southerners understood their importance. For those on the left, these values were either the good or the bad. Were either the bad or the ugly, but they were never the good. For the rest of America, folks had little patience for such nonsense and hoped to keep the flag as a symbol of wholesome values throughout their culture. It's for this reason why the Confederate flag continued to fly in various places throughout Vietnam during that war. Here it is in South Vietnam. I don't know if you can quite make it out. Here it is on a helicopter. Here in a camp. You have the Georgia flag here. Here's another depiction of the Georgia flag in Vietnam. Here's the Quai Son. Then the Duke. Older progressives understood this. In fact, in many ways, a good example of the schizophrenic approach the left as a whole took toward the Confederate flag began to appear in the 1970s. They deplored Southern opposition to progressive legislation and cultural ideals, but they needed Southern votes. Richard Nixon had proved that. And so progressive filmmakers, while they led an attack culturally against the South, others championed the South in the same popular media. And all the while, Southerners are making their statements in the backdrop of the Vietnam War. Here, of course, is an effort to in Vietnam, recapture what was done in Iwo Jima. And yes, if you look on his arm, you can see a Confederate flag on his flight jacket. Americans abroad fighting its wars look to the Confederate flag as a source of inspiration as they made it through one of our darkest periods. Progressive filmmakers quickly trying to turn the South into a center of ignorance and poverty. But some recognize that Southerners who were in fact first Southern could play a role in rejuvenating progressivism for the rest of the country. None better figured better than that than Jimmy Carter. And I have some more pictures of Carter here in just a second. But what essentially happens in the 1970s is you have two approaches. On the one hand, you have this approach where people from the former Confederacy can make a huge and positive difference in the future of the United States. But on the other hand, we need an ignorant and backward population to serve as the laboratory in which progressives redeemed some fallen people. Southerners needed deliverance. Otherwise, the country would face a massacre by chainsaw-wielding Southerners, or otherwise become outlaws like Josie Wells. Now, I like Josie Wells. I understand Josie Wells is kind of an anti-hero, and I'm all for that. So throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the Confederate flag was held in two very different ways. It would be a symbol of Southern rock music and fun, a symbol of Jimmy Carter visiting Brazil and visiting, seeing of Confederate descendants there. But it would also be a symbol to be demonized by triggering organizations like the newly founded Southern Poverty Law Center. But throughout this period, we have this as a Confederate flag, but then we also have this. And Americans were being asked to choose between the two. So what happened? Who won? What happened as the clouds and the dust settled? The change occurred by the early 1990s. And I am now old enough to remember many of you from the early 1990s. And I can remember many conversations. In fact, one of my last conversations with the late Mel Bradford was about this new thing called political correctness. And Mel was sitting in a nearly collapsed metal chair, looking across a room at Marion, the literary scholar, Marion Montgomery. And Mel said, "Marion thinks political correctness is here to stay. I think it's just a fad." Mel was wrong on that. The first explanation of what happened is, in fact, the rise of political correctness, which, if time allows, I'll show graphically here in just a second. By the early 1990s, the virtues expressed by Southern symbols were being turned against themselves. Manliness, bravery, valor, military conquest and defense, courage, selflessness, and above all, a willingness to fight to defend what matters most to a person became vice rather than virtue. And under the doctrines of political correctness, any contrary viewpoint would be neither tolerated nor forgiven. Now, most of this came to a head in the consideration of Columbus's voyage to the Americas in 1992, the 500th anniversary of that event. And I'm not going to go into this because I believe we've already been exposed to that explanation to some degree. But what's important is that in American popular culture in the 1990s saw the almost total absence of the Confederate flag shown in a positive light. Confederate flags came to be represented hate, slavery, rebellion, and social deviancy. From Pulp Fiction to A Time to Kill to Cold Mountain, the South and all it stood for during the 20th century were openly attacked. Even The Simpsons underwent a sort of transportation. In the early episodes of The Simpsons, the Confederate flag actually existed in the map and in the flag of the state where the fictional Springfield was supposedly located. Many people have kind of forgotten about this. No one really knows where Springfield is, but the state flag has a Confederate flag in it. By later episodes in the 1990s, the Confederate flag is only shown associated with characters like Cletus and his tattooed and toothless friends who sit around drinking beer and waving their flag. There's another reason, though, why things came to a head in the 1990s. That's because the South won. There was a point in the 1990s when in the line of succession of the American presidency, you had to go through 6 people before you found someone who was A, not a Southerner, and B, not a Southern Baptist. Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Newt Gingrich, we would say maybe he's not a Southerner, Newt Gingrich, Strom Thurmond, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I forget how it goes from there, but some chairman of some committee in the House of Representatives. Basically, 7 people had to be knocked off before you reached Madeleine Albright, who was Secretary of State. So the Confederate flag during this period of time also went abroad. It went abroad in the War on Terror, for example. As much as we may hate to admit this, the War on Terror was launched by someone who was at one time a Southern governor. But it served the same capacity in the War on Terror in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that it had during World War II. It pops up, and here is the Mississippi flag. Here it is in downtown Baghdad. And from there, it kind of creeps around, and it leaves American hands. And by the early 2000s, the Confederate flag was even being used by African Christians in their effort to defend themselves against Muslims. Here it is in downtown Baghdad. Here it is in Sweden, which makes no sense to me, but nor does the automobile make any sense, nor the churros that are being sold in the background. There's another reason, though, why things come to a head and the flag is attacked. That's because the South loses. By the 2010s, the South fundamentally lost control over national politics, and so too did they lose their symbols. The places where the Confederate flag were most celebrated from this point forward were places like Brazil, and I'm going to jump ahead on this, where descendants of Confederados dance and sing in celebration of their Confederate heritage. There are other places in the world where the Confederate flag still flies, even today. Here is Nepal. Here's Germany, Northern Ireland. Not exactly sure where this one is. Is that Belfast? Okay. Here's Naples. This is Ukraine. Hey, look, long way off. No, they're on the other side of the world. Maybe they lost the flags in transit, the stars in transition. But why now? Let me close. Why are Confederate symbols and flags being taken down now? Where is the fortitude of Southerners to not only defend their heritage, but also the valor and courage needed to always defend one's most vital interests? Now, this is a much more complicated set of questions to answer. First, there's a definite shift in the way Southerners educate their children. This is a national phenomenon. The entire education system, as it is centralized and nationalized, and it's not just in public schools, it's also in the vast network of schools of education policy institutes, and at continuing education organizations, where neither children nor their teachers are simply ever told anything positive about the South. By the way, they're also not taught in those locations anything real about forgiveness, about love, and about dedication to tradition. Second, there is a deep and widening crisis of the American elite. Its separation from rank and file Americans is easily seen on the attack on Confederate symbols, which is why I mentioned at the beginning of this that we probably have people in this room who know how to drive a car. People who know how to drive a car have no problem with a Confederate flag. People who don't drive their own cars are scared of it. Third, and I wish I had a lot more time to go into this, there's a problem with conservatives. Since the end of World War II, conservative intellectuals have championed ideas. They have insisted that ideas have consequences, and the only way to reclaim America, the only way to limit the power of its government, the only way to instill into future generations a willingness to defend what matters most to them is by teaching them ideas. And that's what we have done. And we have created countless think tanks, countless organizations, countless college student initiatives, all aimed at equipping people with the right ideas. And it hasn't gotten us very far. Because all along the way, conservatives forgot that it was the habits of daily life that mattered most. And no matter how many ideas they wish to teach, those things will forever be abstractions if they're not girded and grounded in things people actually do. So conservatism became a movement of people wearing bow ties rather than people who understood the importance of their state flags. Finally, American leaders in the South and elsewhere simply do not understand what's at stake. They see this as an attack on racism, as if that were really the case. And if they were successful in attacking racism, more power to them. But instead, our own leaders last summer let the left turn what was an attack on Christianity, an attack on black Christians, and an attack upon Southerners into a petty crusade against their favorite kicking dog. Our leaders also failed to understand that it is not the symbols that the left hates, but is what those symbols have long reflected. There's a reason why anti-Confederate crusades of last summer coincided with the attacks on traditional marriage. But our leaders couldn't connect the dots. So much for ideas. How long before other symbols are attacked? There are a great many things with long histories of persecution and violence behind them. But as those symbols are attacked, rest assured it is not against what vile things the left associates with them that is being undermined. Rather, it will be against those very good things that people like us associate with matters Southern. Symbols come and go. We can and will survive without a flag. But please do not become so obsessed with symbols, ladies and gentlemen, that we fail to defend those things they symbolize. It is not so much our heritage, nor is it so much about constitutional government, states' rights, human scale, the greatness of our literature, or any of the things that our institute proudly and formally supports. At its very heart, resisting attacks on the Confederate flag, like attacks on traditional marriage, are about defending the things that may matter most to us. What we are witnessing is a war against tolerance, a war against forgiveness. And at its heart is a war against the love that each human being has for his own peculiar place in this fallen world. In some sense, the problems we face now are so much larger than the South. And we knew it was going to happen. We knew in the early 90s that one day we would be here in this situation. I remember Tom Fleming writing about this in the pages of Chronicles. I remember Don talking about this when I first met him some 20 years ago in our conversation with Brian on that fateful day when he made the mistake of introducing himself to us. We talked about this. But ladies and gentlemen, let's take heart. Let's remember that what we need is not more heritage or more symbols. What we need is to remember that there are people in this world worth forgiving, and there are liberties and freedoms worth defending. In a world now filled with hate, We need Confederate symbols more than ever. Not as symbols of resistance and rebellion, but symbols of those things that make our lives worth living. What the left needs is to forgive. What the right needs is to learn once again how to live as common people. What Southerners need is to be left alone.